while we're getting seated here, we'll have lots of time to talk more about the ARC and other things, but we'll also be passing around some materials later to sign up for some of the ARC materials. One is to join the ARC. Tony, how much does it cost to join the ARC?
To join the state chapter is $25.
$25, guys. Come on. I mean, look at it. Every time you turn around, I don't know how you feel. It's $350, right? This is cheap, you know. And the other thing that we'll pass around is there's something Tony puts out once a week called the Monday morning memo, which usually comes out on Monday morning, although not always, right? Monday-ish, you know, Monday in a broad sense. But I will tell you, and I'll tell you, there's two places I get my information. I already got it. Two places I get my information. One is those of you who know Marty Emoto, if you want to keep up on things moment by moment by moment, go to cdcan.us. For those of us who just can't read, you know, everything, the Monday morning memo is something quite readable. Takes about 10 minutes because I'm a slow reader here. And once again, it's a pretty good summary of everything that's going on, not only the statewide and nationally. And we'll talk more about this, about how you can keep up with what's going on here. We're actually not going to be doing formal introductions. In fact, I met Chad about 30 minutes ago. Here he's going to be talking about the ARC of California versus DDS, and he informed me he actually wasn't on the case. I think he was a little young at the time. But what he's going to do is once again go through the history of the Lanterman Act and go through what the Lanterman Act is, and then once again after that we'll be doing more about the Lanterman Act. So anyway, welcome Chad Carlock.
Thank you. Great to see you. Thank you, everybody. Hi, my name is Chad Carlock, and at the risk of starting by dating myself, I was in high school in 1985 when the ARC versus DDS decision was actually decided. So it either made me friends or enemies or both, I'm not quite sure. But I have been practicing in the field of developmental disabilities for 15 years now, if that makes anybody feel any better. And I do civil litigation, but an increasing portion of my practice has been in the developmental disabilities field, working with service providers and increasingly with families and individuals. So my objective here, and in this first portion anyway, I'm going to try as much as I can to keep my editorial comments out of it, though I can't always do that, is to talk about the system, how it came to be. Tony gave a little bit of the background about where the Lanterman Act came from and the driving forces behind that, which were parents and families. Talk about how the system is set up, how the system is supposed to work. You'll hear a little bit more then about how the system is actually working. And that brings us, I think, back around to the involvement of parents and families to preserve the system and to save the system from both financial cuts and even service cuts that have been increasingly piled on to this and so many other fields in the last few years. I didn't go into law thinking this is what I was going to do. I didn't know what I was going to do. First I was going to be a public defender, and then I was going to be an environmental lawyer, and now 15 years later, here I am. I'm also a family member. My uncle is a regional center client in Southern California. So I have that perspective on the system as well. I did work right out of law school for the first 4 years of my practice for David Rosenberg, who was the lead counsel on the Supreme Court case in 1985. So I sort of fell into this, but I think it's no accident that I'm doing what I'm doing today. So our starting point is the Lanterman Developmental Disabilities Services Act. In 1967, when it was first enacted, it was the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act, so everybody could get a piece of the credit. But since then, it's become, and since '69, it's been known as the Lanterman Developmental Disabilities Services Act. This is where you can find it in the Welfare and Institutions Code. The Department of Developmental Services website, which is dds.ca.gov. If you go to their first page on the right-hand side, they have a link to laws and regulations. That will take you to the full text of the Lanterman Act, You can also then get to the regulations that implement the Act, and those are found almost entirely in Title 17 of the California Code of Regulations. There's also a few things in Title 22 that deal with residential facilities and that sort of thing. So, growing out of the parent movement, the Act was enacted in California, and it was really a great experiment at the time, and it's still a great experiment for the reasons we'll talk about in a minute. But as creating an alternative system to the institutions. So the objectives of the Act were, rather than let's warehouse folks and let's put some money over there and take care of their needs the best we can, or what we've decided their needs are and how they would best be served. This is a completely different model. The objective is to develop an array of services and supports that is sufficiently complete. So we're not just talking about one size fits all here, an array of services. And it's designed to meet the needs and choices, that's another new piece of the puzzle here, of each person, individually, each person with developmental disabilities, regardless of their age or their degree of disability. So those needs are going to change over time. As we know, a lot of young families have, with kids that are school age or even younger, have a lot different needs than some of the early parents who now, they're retired or gone, and their family member is now in their 50s and 60s. So the objective was to serve the different needs at each stage of life and to support their integration into the mainstream life of the community. So that can be residential, that can be employment, that can be education. And it depends on the needs and the choices of the individual and the family, what those needs are going to be. That's what the Lanterman Act is designed to do. So how do you do that in a state as large and diverse as California, and with a population as diverse as this population? The ideal here is to have community-based services and supports. So that's where the service providers come in, the nonprofits, the ARCs that are working with the individuals. A wide variety of services. Again, not one size fits all. Maybe one consumer will need transportation. Another consumer can get themselves around, but they need help getting, finding, keeping a job. The way they administer this system is through the regional center system, which was established as sort of an intermediate tier. It's a non-governmental, most of the time, system, except for when it works to their benefit, like being members of PERS, etc., that sort of thing. But the regional centers are set up as community-based nonprofit organizations. They get their money for the state. They're geographically designed. Each has its own catchment area. There are 21 different regional centers across California, so there's not one for each county. It's geographic. Far Northern has, in the top northeast corner of the state, has many different counties. LA County has, I believe, at least half a dozen regional centers that serve various portions of it. The largest in terms of the number of people that are served is the Inland Regional Center, which is Riverside and San Bernardino counties. And that's one regional center for both of those two very large counties. But the function of the regional centers in the system is to administer the service delivery, to orchestrate the IPP process, which we'll talk about in a minute, and to work with the individual service providers to actually bring in the services that each individual needs. The way to reach those objectives is through an individualized assessment and planning process, which results in a document called the IPP, the Individualized Program Plan. That's supposed to be an interdisciplinary team, which includes folks from the regional center, the consumer, and or their family or conservator as appropriate, and any other experts that are needed. Maybe in some cases that'll be folks from the school district or others, to decide what are the goals and objectives of this person to be integrated into the community, to do what they want to do, whether it's school, whether it's work, whether it's independent living, or being supported living at home with their family. And then what services will help meet those needs. That's the objective of the IPP process. So the system is set up here with sort of a hierarchy. The money and the responsibility starts at the top with the state, with DDS. That's a little light up there in the first box, but that's the Department of Developmental Services is the state agency that's charged with administering and overseeing the Lanterman Act. The state contracts on a 5-year basis, it's renewable every 5 years, with the 21 regional centers. It establishes their budget with state and federal money. The regional centers, in turn, as I said, each have their own geographic catchment area. They're responsible for all services within their region. They implement the IPP process, they oversee the process, they obtain services by contracting with vendors, the next level. They're the direct service providers. Those are the people who are in the homes, at the job site, working hands-on with the consumers. There's a variety. Some vendors operate 10 different programs, maybe a transportation program, and a job program, and a residential program, and a supported living program. Other vendors specialize. We only do transportation, but we do it all over this area. Some vendors work with more than one regional center also. Each program, of course, has a slightly different set of regulations that goes with it. So they all have their own rate-setting mechanisms. Some rates are negotiated, some rates are set by the regional centers, some rates are set by the state. All those vendors, because they're funded by the state, also are subject to audits by the regional centers and the state as well. Some programs have to be licensed. So in addition to DDS, there can be Department of Social Services and other licensing issues that the vendors have to deal with. And then finally, the sort of the ultimate recipient of the services here is the consumer, the person with developmental disability and or their family, their support group. Some folks don't have family or support group, either because of age or because they've made the choice they want to live as independently as possible. They don't want their family members involved in their decision-making process. That can be an issue sometimes as well. So that's the basic overview of how the system was set up by the Lanterman Act. The Act specifies a long list. In fact, you can see here at the bottom, this is subsection J of 4502. In fact, I believe there are so many enumerated rights in this section that they had to reuse the alphabet. There's AAs and BBs and CCs. So I'm going to highlight just a few of them. But the specific right that affects the IPP process and services are the right to make choices in your own lives, including but not limited to where and with whom they live. So this can be an important thing for a lot of families and individuals. Their relationships with people in their community, how they spend their time, including education, employment, and leisure, pursuit of their personal future, and program planning and implementation. So one of the rights that is granted by the Act, this would be something that you might think, gee, we don't need an Act to grant us these rights, do we? But that's part of the movement here. It took an actual explicit recognition that yes, people with disabilities have the right to make these choices, and it's the obligation of the state to respect those choices. That's part of what the Lanterman Act is all about, respecting those choices. The code says that the recipients of state funding, all those pieces of the system that we just talked about, have an obligation to respect the choices made by consumers and their parents, legal guardian, or conservator. Sometimes more than one. In terms of some limited conservatorships, you have a situation where you still, even though you have a conservator, you still want to involve the individual in making certain choices, and at least making sure that they have the information that they need to understand what's going to happen with their services, with their employment, with their living arrangements. And the pieces of the system, each piece of the system is charged with providing those consumers with opportunities to exercise decision-making skills in any aspect of day-to-day living. And they have an obligation to provide those consumers, or their conservator, or their family member, or all three, with relevant information in an understandable form. And that can vary depending on the consumer's level of functioning, the parent's level of interest, education, language. I was at a seminar a couple nights ago in Southern California, and one of the most helpful feedback things at the end of the presentation was, these were great materials, can we get them in Spanish? And those sorts of things that maybe a lot of agencies don't think about out of the gate are critical to allowing a lot of people to participate in this process and be empowered to make decisions. So the legislature was very clear in the act that their intent was to create a system that takes into account the needs and preferences of the individual, and that the IPP that results from this whole process, and that then is implemented through the funding mechanisms, that it reflects those preferences and choices. So that's what the Act said, in going back to 67 and really fleshed out in 69 going forward. Then the ARC versus DDS decision came along in 1985 and really opened a lot of people's eyes. It showed people how important the Lanterman Act really is, how special California's system really is, and what we have to lose if that system continues to erode as it has been. So ARC versus the Department of Developmental Services was a Supreme Court case from 1985. As I said, I worked for David Rosenberg, who was lead counsel on that case. He's now presiding judge in Yolo County. In 1985, he was with a law firm in Sacramento that took on the ARC as a client and pursued this case. Now, it arose out of, surprise, a budget crisis in 1982. It took 3 years for it to make its way through to the California Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court reviewed for the first time, this was the first real, certainly the first Supreme Court review, the first in-depth review, 18 years after the Act, of what the Lanterman Act really was, what it did, and what it meant. It established conclusively, and using the magic words for the first time, that the Lanterman Act created an entitlement to services in California for people with developmental disabilities. Now, a lot of people, especially a lot of young families, don't appreciate that. California is the only state in the nation that has, or has ever had, an entitlement to services for people with developmental disabilities. It's the only place in the world, no other country, has an entitlement to services like California does. And that entitlement was recognized, not created by, but recognized by the Supreme Court in the ARC versus DDS decision. In doing that, the Supreme Court restricted the ability of the state to reduce services across the board in response to a budget crisis. In the half-dozen budget crises since then, there have been different creative attempts to try to do the same sorts of things to save money that were covered by the Supreme Court decision in 1985. It wouldn't surprise me if there's another Supreme Court decision in the next decade dealing with the current efforts to save money in the system. The Supreme Court recognized the central role of the individual program plan and person-centered planning as the key, the heart of the Lanterman Act. The state had argued that the level of funding was what determined the services that individuals would get, and the court clearly rejected that. It said for the first time that regional centers had a mandatory obligation to implement the IPP. The IPP is the critical document for each person. It says what services the regional center not can provide if they feel like, not can provide if they can afford it, but must provide. They had talked a little bit about what happens when the money runs out, which is certainly topical now and is going to continue to be for the next few years. So we'll return to that. But they had some guidance about how that works. And I think it has a lot of implications for what happens going forward. Now, I asked David Rosenberg when I first presented a little historical thing a couple years ago. I think we did an anniversary of the decision for one of the ARC meetings. And I'm an ARC member, by the way, best $25 I've ever spent. Thank you, Tony. So I asked David Rosenberg, for a couple of good sound bites, and even though the act was 15 years old, it was clear to everyone at the time on both sides, from the state and from the ARC side, that nobody knew exactly what the court was going to do with it, because the act had never been really interpreted. The regional centers were being set up. It started with 2 and had grown. Now we have 21. But the regional centers they each carved out their new geographic area, and they were doing their thing, and they were getting their money, and they were getting services. But it wasn't clear what the obligations were. So they really were treading new ground and establishing, going forward from 1985, what the relationship was, what the role of the state is. That's still, even in the last few months, there's been some question about what exactly the extent of the state's obligation is in oversight, for example. And the department has gone all the way back to the 1985 decision. So we may still be interpreting the 1985 decision in the next year going forward. But it established what the state's obligations were, what the regional center's obligations were, and the central role of the IPP and the consumer. So when the case came up to the Supreme Court, it was very questionable what was going to happen. The department had, in response to the budget crisis, promulgated a series of across-the-board funding guidelines. We will only fund this much of each service. We will not fund that service anymore for anybody, regardless of need, regardless of what their IPP says. We're doing this because we only have X dollars, and this is how we're going to implement these cuts. And they did that administratively. The ARC was successful at the lower court level of getting that enjoined and preventing the application of those guidelines. Now, this is 1984, so of course the headline was the case dealt with cuts in retarded funding. And I'm hopeful that we can, the language now will be a little bit more up to date, but in fact what happened was that the Supreme Court agreed with the lower court and upheld the injunction, said, no, state of California, you cannot impose these across-the-board categorical reductions, that was the magic word, in services. Since then, the states and the regional centers have been trying to figure out how to do the same thing without calling them categorical reductions in various ways, which keeps people like me busy. But the Supreme Court said that the Lanterman Act had in fact created an entitlement to services at state expense. The state was obligated to carry out these mandates. When the legislature said we are creating a right, they actually meant it. The IPP not funding is the primary driver of the system. That DDS cannot administratively, on its own, without the legislature's approval, diminish the scope of the act, reduce the level of services, simply in order to save money. And the only way that those kinds of changes could actually be made is by the legislature going back and substantively changing the Lanterman Act. Either reducing the scope of eligibility, reducing the types of services that the state can provide, that kind of thing. So the remedy when the money runs out, and I think there's a slide on this in a minute, is rather than DDS saying we're just not going to fund that anymore, their obligation is to go to the legislature and say, legislature, it's your responsibility to either allocate more money so we can do what we're obligated to do by the entitlement, or reduce the scope of the entitlement. There's been some tinkering around on both ends of that in the last year. The legislature, for the most part, wants to avoid the problem altogether and not take the responsibility for making those hard decisions. I think that could probably be said for mental health and lots of other subject areas about the legislature. But the Supreme Court decision said that is the remedy when services run out, not to stop providing services. Now this is a quote from the from the decision here, the Act clearly defines a right of the developmentally disabled person to be provided with services and the corresponding obligation of the state to provide those services. The department, even the department in 1985 had argued that it's not an absolute entitlement, it's only subject to the annual budget allocation. We're happy to provide services until the money runs out, and then that's the end of our obligation. The court said no. Through the IPP procedure, the developmentally disabled person on an individual basis receives as an entitlement those services that enable him, now it's him because this is 1985, so again, their language wasn't quite up to date, but to live a more independent and productive life in the community. Now what that means varies from person to person. What those services and supports are to achieve what that person wants to in the community. So, and a lot of the involvement that I've had with parents in the last year or so has been working with them on understanding the importance of the IPP process. Many of them have had their family members in the system for years, decades even, and don't know what the IPP process is, think that it's a document that they get once in a while from the regional center that tells them what services they're going to get, or don't understand how to participate and that it's actually a tool for them to get what they need for their family. It is through the IPP procedure that the right that the Act grants is implemented. That is the magic document. If it's in your IPP, the regional center is obligated to do its best to get it for you. I won't go too far afield, but some regional centers have been, well, you know, that service is not available, or you're going to have to go somewhere else, or this is the one and only vendor that's going to provide this service. Now, that's not the full information that the Act requires. That's not the fully informed choice that the Act aspires to. As I said, DDS had argued that if there's an entitlement at all, it's only up to the amount of money that the state had allocated. And the court said specifically, they used words like the state shall, and they used words like obligation in the Act. If they wanted to use wishy-washy, conditional, you know, you'll get these services as long as we have money, the legislature knows how to do that. They do that all the time. They didn't do that in the Lanterman Act. Now, I would submit that may be because some of those parents back in the late 60s and 70s were smarter than a lot of people give them credit for. And the language that went into the Act was that strong, mandatory language. The legislature may or may not have noticed it at the time, but they passed the darn thing, and 15 years later the court said, well, they said it, we're going to have to assume that they meant what they said. Now, the court also said that through the budget process, they can't grant authority to a state agency to change the substantive law. Because what the spending guidelines were doing was basically said, well, yeah, the Lanterman Act says you can get any services you need, but because we can only afford this much this year, we're only going to give you 80% of what we need, for example. That gives the administrative agency the power administratively to alter the scope of the Lanterman Act. And the court said you can't do that. Only the legislature in a substantive bill can do that. Now, since 1985, in this area and lots of other areas, there's been some monkey business around changing substantive law in other ways. In the last several years in particular, substantive changes have been made by the legislature, but not in a free standalone bill that's gone through all the committees and had public hearings and that kind of thing. But 2 or 3 months late, into the next budget year, as part of the trailer bill process, where the main budget bill goes through and then the implementing bills are passed along with it. In the last several years, various substantive changes to this system have been made through that process. Now, whether or not that really is an end run around this requirement of the ARC versus DDS case is sort of an open question. Who knows, maybe someone will litigate that someday. 2 years ago, a lot of changes were made to early start programs. 17,000 children and families that were eligible the year before, then were no longer eligible for services because the legislature made a substantive change. This year, there's going to be some other substantive changes that have just gone through, and there's still a question about how they're going to be implemented and when they're going to be implemented. But a lot of parents and families find out about these services not when they're being considered by the state, but when it affects them, when they're suddenly being told, oh, we don't do social recreation anymore, for example. That was another substantive change that's just happened in the last few years. So the decision said that DDS unilaterally cannot impose a categorical reduction in services. If the legislature signs off on it, then it's a different question. But a regional center on its own cannot simply say, we're now going to give everybody 2/3 of the respite hours, for example, that they would otherwise get, just because we need to do that to save money. What the spending directives that were the subject of this case did were requiring the regional centers to cut back on services by category without regard to the client's individual IPP. So what it basically, what the court said was that would have been an end run around the IPP process and an end run about the rights of the individuals and the obligations that were created by the Act. That's an administrative change to the Lanterman Act and was then constitutionally impermissible. So they did briefly address then, what are the regional centers supposed to do when they run out of money? What is DDS supposed to do when it runs out of money? Because especially in recent years, the budget crises have been coming fast and furious. I think we've spent more time in them than out of them in the last decade. Each time that happens, the question comes up, the system 10 years ago wasn't adequately funded. And then with rate freezes and all the other substantive and budgetary reductions that have happened in the last few years, how can we possibly carry out an entitlement when the pool of individuals continues to grow because people are living longer and more children and infants are coming into the system while the available resources are going down? So the administration is in between a bit of a rock and a hard place. What are they supposed to do? The defendants, in this case that was the DDS, said, well, we certainly, how can we be expected to fully implement everyone's IPP? We only get a certain amount of money from the legislature. So what the court said was, as long as funds remain, the right must be implemented in full. As soon as they are exhausted, it can no longer be implemented, but may be financed through an additional appropriation if the legislature so chooses. So the ball's back in the legislature's court here. And I think that in the future, parents need to, and families and advocates and individuals, shine that spotlight directly on the legislature where it belongs. The entitlement is not being fully implemented because you're not allocating enough money, legislature. It's a conscious choice whether or not to finance an additional appropriation. They have to make lots of hard choices. I'll give them that. But it's their choice to make. The director of DDS then, they directed to seek relief from the legislature, which could either appropriate more funds or reduce the entitlement by amending the Lanterman Act. Now that is a real possibility. That's been happening on a small scale over the last 3 years through chipping away of the entitlement and carve-outs of little pieces here and there. But I think it's important to recognize that because this is such a unique system, because it is an entitlement, and because of the financial and other pressures on the system, there is a real possibility that people need to get their heads around, that the entitlement could go away. That California could go to a system like many other states have, where you have waiting lists of up to a decade to get services. If your infant with special needs isn't going to get services until they're 14, that makes a big difference for their life, for the life of the family, and for the services that are going to ultimately be needed when that individual finally does get into the system. What DDS did in 1985 was preventing the shortfall by administratively altering the Act to give the developmentally disabled people something less than the entitlement. The court also talked about the role of regional centers in the system. They said it is true that the regional centers have wide discretion in determining how to implement the IPP. After all, they're the administrators here. They're the ones that have to go out and get the services for the consumer. They're the ones that have to hold the IPP meetings and work with the families to develop the IPPs. But the court said they have no discretion at all in determining whether to implement it. They must do so. So advice I always give to parents and families is if there's any service that you think your family member needs or might need or could need, get it in that IPP. If it is in the IPP, the regional center is obligated, as long as they have funds remaining to do it, to make it happen. We don't have any providers that do that, or we don't give that service anymore is not an acceptable answer. If it's in the IPP, now the consumer may or may not need that at that time, but it still needs to be in the IPP. The regional center is the provider of last resort here. If it's not a service that the regional center provides, but it's a service the individual needs, it still needs to be in the IPP. If that medical insurance goes away, if somebody loses their job, for example, but medical services are in the IPP, healthy dental, those sorts of things that you might not otherwise think about. If that's in the IPP and there's no other resource that can provide that, it is the regional center's obligation to do it. They do have the discretion, if transportation services, for example, are in the IPP. They have some discretion, and in fact they have a directive under the regulations to choose the least costly vendor that can adequately provide the service. That's always the part that the regional centers kind of drop out. They like the least costly part, but it still has to meet the needs. They have some discretion to choose transportation provider A instead of transportation provider B, but they don't have the discretion of whether or not to provide transportation. So the Lanterman Act sets up an ideal of the way the process is supposed to work. Now, if you'll look closely at this, it's a little bit light here still in the first box, but this is the structure of the system that we talked about earlier, but turned upside down, with the client where they belong, at the top. This is a person-centered process. It's an individualized needs determination through the IPP process. And we can talk a little bit more about what the IPP process is and how it works if we have a little bit of time for questions at the end. I'm going to try to repeat them back so they'll show up for our friends on video. And then the Act specifically lists the rights of the individuals with developmental disabilities, gives them choices, the power to make choices in their lives that the system is designed to help implement, and that the system is supposed to respect those choices. Now again, here we're talking about the ideal. We can talk some more also about how that has worked since 1985 and the current stresses on the system as well. So the client is the primary driver of the system. It's supposed to be the primary driver of the system. It should be centered on meeting the needs of the individual and their family. The vendors do that on a daily basis. They show up at their house. They take them to their job. They help them, support them in an independent living arrangement. The vendors are supposed to be direct support and a source of information and advocacy for families. The ARC works with a lot of families directly, also works with a lot of service providers to help get the information out to the families and to the individuals. The regional centers are tasked with creating the IPPs for the individuals. Every consumer has their own IPP. It's supposed to be updated at least every 3 years. For those folks who are on the home and community-based waiver, which means the federal government backfills some of the funding, their IPPs are supposed to be updated every year. The regional centers oversee that IPP process. Another important fact, and this is where you can be a helpful resource for your families and individuals you're working with, a lot of families and individuals do not know that they have the absolute right to call a meeting to update their IPP at any time. The regional center has to hold a meeting within 30 days of that request. Many families who are grateful for whatever services they get wait until they hear from the regional center that it's time to update your plan. Sometimes that happens within the 3 years it's supposed to. Oftentimes it doesn't. Sometimes it only happens when the regional center wants to change something about the services. Not when an individual or family says, we're not happy with this, we need more of one service or another, or we need to change providers, for example. The regional centers are supposed to select the services that best meet those needs. They have to do that within their budget. They have a difficult job as well. But their primary objective should be not meeting their budgetary goals or saving money for themselves, but meeting the needs of all the consumers in all their IPPs. So the role of DDS then here is to oversee compliance with the Lanterman Act. They're not out there. The state does not have state employees out there providing services. The state contracts with the regional centers who contract with the direct service providers. But they have the obligation to make sure that the regional centers and the vendors are following the rules, that the IPP is being done the way it's supposed to be done, that vendors are being chosen in a fair and equitable manner. There's going to be, I think, the state auditor's report that just came out dealing with the regional center system said there are some significant questions about transparency and oversight in this system. That's going to continue to hash itself out over the next few years, and the ARC, I think, will be a big part of that. The other thing that DDS is tasked with doing is to making sure that the entitlement is funded. They have to follow through on that obligation. When they run out of money, it's part of their responsibility to go back to the legislature and make the case that this system is not being adequately funded. And legislature, you have a hard choice to make. You either have to find those dollars, or you have to change the act, reduce, eliminate, change the entitlement so that we can afford to do everything that we're required to do. Now, those are unpopular. Nobody wants to be the legislature who votes for that, right? But you also have to be a legislator that votes for the budget. They haven't been called to task to make those hard choices. The approach of the legislature for the last few years has been we need to come up with X dollars to trim out of this system. Administrators, you're the ones who are doing this on a day-to-day basis. You figure it out. You tell us how best to do it. And then we can sort of pawn it off on you. That's exactly the kind of thing that got them into this trouble in 1985 with the California Supreme Court decision. So how much longer they'll be able to get away with that as well is an open question. And a big piece of the answer to that is how much longer they'll be able to get away with it has to do with advocates. It has to do with families. It has to do with individuals who are being affected in their daily lives by these decisions. Whether they take it on themselves to get educated, to advocate for themselves, and to let legislators know that these are problems that are actually happening and affecting them. If all they're hearing is from the department and the regional centers and those folks who get in front of them and say, well, you know, we're doing the best we can and we think the system is working well, that's what legislatures hear. If they don't hear those other stories, they're not going to be motivated to allocate the money or to take responsibility for those hard choices. And for the most part, as I said, I want to not end on a completely down note. We do have, believe it or not, despite all its flaws, the best system in the world for people with developmental disabilities. There's a lot of work to be done to make sure that we live up to this ideal. And so that's where the window for advocacy and for individuals and people like you working for and with these folks and with organizations like the ARC and other folks in attorneys and others in the industry who understand what can be done and what the tools are that you can put into people's hands. Because these are parents, these are families, these are individuals. It's not too hard to motivate them. They want this system to work. They need this system to work. And if we can give them the tools to do that, they'll be in a much better position to get what they need for themselves and their families. So, thank you. We have a few questions here that I'm going to read so they show up on here, and then we'll move on to John, who's going to talk about being a service provider and how the system works from the inside. First question, how do you advise families who have some financial freedom and are reluctant to push for IPP services? Well, regional centers love those families because then they can fall back on what they call generic resources, which is anything that they don't have to pay for, anything that's generally available. For instance, if they can make the case that it's appropriate for a consumer to ride the public bus instead of them paying for transportation. Number one, that's more integrated. That's a good thing. But there are situations where that can create health and safety problems unless that person is given enough support. For families with resources, their fallback is always going to be, I don't want to have to fight with the regional center. I can afford to do this on my own. And sometimes that is a better approach in terms of solving the problem for them. If they need the services, if they need it now, if they have the means to do that, then that is something that, I wouldn't rule that out. At the same time, I would go back to the one thing I did say, which was make sure that it's in the IPP, even if it's the parent that's providing it. They may not always be in that financial position. A lot of parents aren't in the financial position to go through the IPP appeals process. There is a process in place where if the regional center refuses a service that you ask for in your IPP, they have to give you written notice that they're denying you that service, and there's an appeals process that you go through. Many families don't have the time or energy or resources to fight that. The regional center will have 3 or 4 people and a lawyer in the room, and the parent will be there if they're lucky. Yes?
Just a follow-up. For services that a parent can provide, for example, you say put it in the IPP, are you allowed to say a parent will provide and then circumstances change?
Yes, it's currently, here's how it's this need, make sure the need is listed in there. Here's how it is currently being met. On the Monday night seminar I was at in Southern California, there was a woman there who had health insurance through her husband's employment. They have one child with a developmental disability who needed various services, and the regional center was telling them, well, your health insurance covers all your other children. This is something that your health insurance needs to be providing. Well, if that husband loses that job and it's not in the IPP, the regional center is not going to be highly motivated to go out of their way to update it and get that into the IPP. If it's already there, but the financial means to do that disappears, then there's already a mechanism in place to get that. Is there a list of services available for consumers of the regional center? That's a very good question. There should be. Some regional centers, each of them independently tracks this sort of thing. One thing that, as far as I know, at least no regional center is admitted to having, is a list of all the providers within their area. Since they have to license them all and they vendor them all, it seemed like that wouldn't be too hard to do, right? Apparently, at least what we've been told, they don't exist. That makes things very difficult for families. And a lot of families aren't, again, the regional center won't go out of their way to volunteer some other service that they might be able to pay for your family member. That's why connecting with other families through things like the ARC and the Family Resource Center is so important. Families teaching families, oh, I've been through that problem, here's how we handled it, here's how we got that service. Those sorts of things, unfortunately, right now are done on a word-of-mouth basis for the most part. That's something we would like to see developed, is sort of a comprehensive list. Here's your menu. And that menu should be constantly updated, and the variety of services should be constantly improved. But there is no central menu currently for vendors. You can go into the Lanterman Act and look at the regulations to see here's what the different types of services are, but then it varies from regional center to regional center, how many providers of that service there are, whether or not they fund them. For example, some regional centers have said, we don't do respite anymore, or we only do X hours of respite, and so there's a lot of different issues with that. But there is a menu of services that are set out in the Act. But whether or not they're available and the extent to which they're available varies by regional center. What future goals do you see for people with developmental disabilities? And how do we continue to support them in the future? I think, unfortunately, we're at a stage right now in our state and country where holding the line is probably the short-term and maybe the medium-term goal. And it's going to take a lot of work by a lot of advocates inside the system and outside the system that are willing to work with us just to do that. Beyond that, we want to try to minimize cuts, first of all. We want to keep those cuts as far away from the lives of the individuals as we can. Further up the chain of command we can keep those cuts, the better. Eventually, we'll need to look at restoring some of the things that have been carved out in the last few years. And eventually, the objective, I think the long-term objective, is full implementation of the entitlement in California. If we can show people that the system can work without bankrupting the state, then it will be the kind of thing that may spread to other states and other countries, as opposed to the approaches that have been taken elsewhere, filtering down back into California, and us taking a step backwards. Any indication that the Lanterman Act will be modified to reduce the services offered? Nobody wants to say it out loud, but yes, it is out there. Every year there is a proposal or two, legislatively or otherwise. I think the last, during Arnold Schwarzenegger's tenure, he actually said out loud on 2 different occasions that I'm aware of that he would consider suspending the entitlement. One in his first fiscal crisis in his first term, and one about 2 years ago. Thankfully, and rightfully so, there was some significant backlash to that, and a lot of advocates and parents and others called him on it, and he backed down. But that's not to say that it won't happen. I'm sure the Department of Finance, internally at least, kicks that around every year. And whether it sees the light of day or not varies from year to year. But it is a real threat that either the scope of the entitlement could be reduced, or the entitlement could be eliminated completely, and the state could go to a system where, you know, and there's various ways that we could do it. We'll serve the most needy, however they choose to define that. Or we'll serve everybody, but only to this level. Or we'll have waiting lists. Once you get into the system, then you get whatever services we can give you for the rest of your life, but until you get into the system, you get nothing. That's what a lot of states do, and that is a real possibility. So those were the written questions. I thank you. I won't be around the rest of the day, but I will be sticking around a little bit, so I'd be happy to answer other questions in the back. I also have cards on the back table, so if you want to email me outside of this with other questions or follow-ups, I'd be happy to talk with you as well, and I thank you for having me here today.
I know we serve a lot of families with developmental disabilities, and for instance, we have a lot of families that will move to Colorado. I think our biggest export to Colorado are Californians, and they're shocked when they show up to Colorado and they say, "Here I am with my disabled child." And they go, "Cool, we're going to put you on a waiting list." And go, "Say what?" And it's one of those things that's so foreign to us. One of these things, if you didn't pick this up, the entitlement is really, really important. And once again, it's something that we as advocates need to continue.